The sound cracked across the courthouse steps like a gavel dropped too hard. "Stand down, boy." A uniformed hand shoved him hard across the chest. The impact wasn't just against fabric and bone, it was against silence, against dignity, against the marble pillars towering like judges above them. Gasps erupted. Phones rose like a forest of small, glowing eyes. A dozen witnesses froze mid-stride on the stone plaza, staring at the sight of a black man in a tailored Navy suit, pushed like a criminal before the very house of law. He didn't stumble. His polished shoes scraped against the steps, but he planted himself again as if the stone had chosen him. His grip on the brown leather briefcase never broke. Only his eyes moved steady, unblinking, cutting straight through the chaos with a calm that made the violence louder. The officer jabbed a finger toward his chest, voice sharp enough to carry over the crowd. "You don't belong on these stairs. Not dressed like that. Not here." Murmurs spread. A law student whispered to her friend, "Are they really doing this? Right here?" Another voice, shaky but clear, answered, "I'm recording everything." Two more officers flanked the man, gripping his arms like he was resisting, though his posture remained motionless. The crowd could see it. Cameras zoomed closer. The man's silence was heavier than the shouting. It pulled the plaza inward, every eye on him, every phone trembling in someone's grip. It was as if a storm had built, not in the sky, but in his stillness. Behind him, the courthouse doors loomed high, carved oak and brass, doors that had seen verdicts, confessions, lies. Today, they would witness something else. A test of power measured not in decibels, but in composure. The officer who shoved him barked again, louder now. "Step down or we'll make you. Last warning." The words didn't sound like law. They sounded like fear dressed as authority. And still no reply. Just that unwavering stare, that calm posture, the briefcase held like a seal of judgment waiting to be opened. Someone in the back shouted, "Why isn't anyone stopping this?" Another whispered, "Because they think he's nobody." But the man was not nobody. He was more than the uniforms could imagine. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Carter. The officer shoved again, harder this time, trying to force movement. The crowd flinched forward, phones trembling. Every second stretched, every heartbeat echoed against the stone walls. The man didn't budge. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet enough to freeze the square. "You've made a mistake." No one yet knew how deep that mistake ran. The shove should have knocked him down the stairs. Instead, he stood rooted, calm, immovable. That calm stung worse than defiance. The officer's jaw tightened. "Restrain him," he barked. Two more uniforms stepped in, gripping the man's arms as if hauling a trespasser from private property. His briefcase slipped from his hand, thudding against the stone, sliding to rest against a step. The crowd gasped again, phones angling lower to catch every detail. From the side, a junior clerk in a gray suit whispered, "That's not right. He hasn't done anything." But her voice drowned beneath the scrape of boots and the clatter of radios. The man remained silent. His eyes followed the briefcase on the ground, not with panic, but with patience, as though he already knew how this scene would end. One officer sneered, leaning close enough for the crowd to hear, "Don't try to play lawyer. That suit doesn't make you one." The words weren't law. They were venom. Someone in the gathering spoke up louder this time, a young law student clutching her books to her chest. "He didn't resist. You can't treat him like that." Her voice wavered but cut through the plaza. A few heads nodded. One man muttered, "This is wrong." The officer ignored them, turning back to his captive. "You've got 5 seconds to step off these stairs, or we'll drag you." A ripple of tension spread. The plaza felt less like a civic space and more like a courtroom, without walls, every witness, every phone, every whispered protest forming a silent jury. And yet the man said nothing. He let the silence stretch, the weight of composure pulling tighter with each second. The officers fumed, their grip rougher, their posture louder. The senior officer yanked at the briefcase, lifting it from the step. He shook it once, smirk curling. "What's in here? Fake files? Counterfeit papers? We'll find out." He dropped it again, deliberately, letting the latch rattle. The insult was clear. The man's gaze finally shifted, calm but cutting. He spoke not to the officer, but to the air, to the crowd that held its breath. "Protocol is watching." The words were strange, almost cryptic, but they landed heavy. Phones zoomed in, capturing the expressionless face, the measured tone. The officer scoffed. Protocol? Out here, I'm the law. But unease spread across the front rows of the crowd. A clerk whispered to her colleague, Did he say protocol? Like, internal? The man straightened, his voice low, steady, unmistakably certain. You think you're protecting this court? You're dismantling it. The crowd erupted in murmurs, a wave of energy rolling across the steps. The officers held on tighter, but their certainty was cracking. And for the first time, one question hung over the plaza, louder than any order. Who is he? The word protocol rippled through the air like a code only some could recognize. Phones didn't lower, they steadied. Fingers pressed harder on record buttons. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were documenting. On the steps, the officers tightened their grip. The senior one barked, Enough! Get him off these stairs. His voice cracked like a whip, louder than law, more desperate than procedure. They pulled, but the man didn't move. His stance anchored, his shoulders squared. He wasn't resisting. He was rooted. From the edge of the crowd, a woman's voice rang out clear, trembling but fierce. I saw him arrive. He walked in like everyone else. He didn't break a single rule. Heads turned. A law intern, no more than 23, stood with her phone raised. The courage in her tone cut deeper than her age should allow. The officer snapped back, Stay out of this. But her words had broken the silence barrier. Another voice followed, a middle-aged man in a business coat. She's right. You're assaulting him on the courthouse steps. The crowd swelled with murmurs, some angry, some incredulous. A chorus was forming. The senior officer lifted his radio. Dispatch, possible agitator, send backup. That word agitator spurred the crowd further. Students shifted closer to the steps. Clerks whispered nervously. A passerby muttered, Agitator? For standing still? The man in the navy suit lowered his gaze briefly, a memory flashing behind his stillness. 20 years ago, a younger version of himself had stood outside another courthouse, waiting for his hearing to begin. He was mistaken for a janitor then, told to wait outside until the real clients arrive. The shame had burned, but he never let it consume him. Today, that same energy surfaced, not as anger, but as armor. The present snapped back when one officer bent to grab the briefcase again. A spectator shouted, That's theft! Leave his property alone! Another added, You can't just take it. The officer sneered at the crowd. Mind your business. But the business was no longer private. Phones were raised higher. Voices carried. The plaza itself seemed to tilt against the uniforms. The man finally spoke again, voice low but audible. You've mistaken silence for surrender. The officer shoved once more, harsher, trying to silence words with force. The crowd gasped, outrage sharpening. And then, from the far side, a courthouse clerk, her badge still pinned to her chest, stepped forward. She spoke carefully but firmly enough for all to hear. I know who he is. The crowd stilled. Even the officers hesitated. The clerk's hands trembled at her sides, but her words didn't falter. You're making a mistake you won't survive in uniform. Murmurs exploded. Phones panned toward her, then back to the man in the navy suit. And for the first time, the officer's confidence cracked, visible in their eyes, because whispers had turned into testimony. And testimony was the beginning of judgment. The tension was no longer invisible. It pressed down on the courthouse plaza like a storm front, thick and charged. The officers felt it too, though they wouldn't admit it. Their hands grew rougher, their shoves harder. They had to reassert control, to drown out the murmurs building like thunder behind them. The senior officer snarled, yanking the briefcase from the ground once more. This time, he didn't just shake it, he hurled it down the steps. Leather scraped against stone. Metal clasps splitting open as papers spilled across the plaza. Gasps erupted. Phones caught the moment in sharp detail, files scattering, pages fluttering like torn verdicts. The crowd recoiled, then leaned closer, their outrage now uncontainable. You can't do that? A woman shouted from the front row, her voice sharp with fury. That's destruction of property! The officer sneered, raising his voice for everyone to hear. Better his fake papers scatter here than poison the court inside. The insult hung jagged in the air. People muttered, some swearing under their breath. The law intern from before stepped forward, phone raised high. Those aren't fake. That's evidence. You're breaking the law. The officer's eyes narrowed. He jabbed his finger toward her. Step back before you join him. But the crowd was no longer intimidated. Phones glowed brighter, closer. A chant began, quiet at first, from 2 or 3 voices. "This is wrong! This is wrong!" The man in the navy suit still hadn't moved. His face, calm and deliberate, turned toward the officers. His voice, steady, carved through the rising noise. "You just crossed into contempt not of me, but of this court." "Oh?" The senior officer laughed, though the sound rang hollow. "Contempt? You think throwing you off these steps is contempt? You've got nothing." His words only sharpened the air. Another officer, younger, hot-headed, gripped the man's wrist and twisted sharply, forcing his arm behind his back. The crowd erupted again, shouts, curses, the frantic shuffle of people pressing forward. A middle-aged attorney pushed to the front, his briefcase still in hand. "That's unlawful force," he bellowed, his voice carrying like he was already in the courtroom. "You're violating your oath on the steps of justice itself." The officer holding the wrist only twisted harder, growling under his breath. "Shut up and stay quiet." Phones zoomed in, catching the grimace of force, the imbalance of power. One student yelled, "He hasn't even raised his voice once, and you're treating him like this?" The crowd wasn't just documenting anymore. They were indicting every shout, every angle, every gasp adding to a chorus of judgment. And still, the man remained calm. His arm wrenched, his papers scattered, his briefcase thrown but his composure unshaken. He lifted his head, and for the first time, his voice rose not loud, but clear, commanding. "You are not protecting the law. You are humiliating it." The words rang across the plaza. Even the officers froze for a heartbeat. And in that pause, the atmosphere shifted. Because what they had done was no longer an act of control. It was an act of exposure. And exposure always leads to reckoning. The papers lay scattered like fallen verdicts across the marble steps. Some pages drifted down toward the plaza, caught under the shoes of stunned bystanders. The image was too much to ignore, too blatant to excuse. Phones captured everything. A dozen red recording lights glowed, steady as witnesses that could not be silenced. The crowd pressed closer, murmurs swelling into a current that even the uniforms couldn't dam. From the front row, the law intern who had spoken before raised her voice again, stronger this time, trembling less. "Everyone can see it. He hasn't resisted once. You're the only ones escalating." Her words echoed, amplified by the plaza's acoustics. For the first time, officers shifted uneasily. Their authority wasn't absolute anymore. It was being contested, live, in front of cameras and strangers who refused to look away. The younger officer twisting the man's arm hissed through his teeth, "You want to resist? You'll be on the ground." But the man didn't resist. He stood like an anchor sunk into stone, his composure infuriating to those trying to break him. A voice rang out from deeper in the crowd, a middle-aged woman clutching her phone aloft. "I'm streaming this right now. Thousands are watching." Heads turned. Phones lifted higher. The energy shifted from isolated recordings to a collective broadcast. What was once a private abuse was now a public trial. The senior officer snapped, "Put those phones down." He jabbed at the crowd. "This is an active situation." "Active abuse," someone shot back. The words landed like a gavel strike. A chorus followed. "Abuse! Abuse! Abuse!" The chant swelled, a tide rolling over the officer's commands. The man in the navy suit lifted his chin slightly, eyes scanning the steps littered with his scattered documents. Calm still, but now his gaze carried weight like a judge weighing testimony. He spoke again, each word clear, measured. "Do you hear them? They're not recording chaos, they're recording truth." Silence cut briefly through the chant. Even the officers faltered, caught between his words and the crowd's rising fury. A clerk in a tan blazer stepped forward from the courthouse doors, voice shaking but loud enough. "I can confirm his name is in the docket today. He's not an intruder. He's scheduled to be here." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Confirmation. Evidence. The first crack in the narrative the officers had tried to build. The senior officer turned on the clerk, barking, "Get back inside before you regret it." But the threat landed flat. Phones had already caught the admission. The crowd buzzed, voices overlapping. "He belongs here." They knew it. "It's all on record." The man didn't smile. He didn't need to. His stillness was louder than applause. He looked toward the officers restraining him, his tone sharp enough to slice the air. "You're not dragging me from these steps. You're dragging yourselves into evidence." The crowd erupted again, some cheering, some gasping, all realizing this was no longer just confrontation. It was testimony unfolding live. And testimony, once spoken, could never be unsaid. The chant still vibrated through the plaza when a new voice cut across it, sharp, authoritative, layered with disdain. "What's going on out here?" A man in a gray three-piece suit strode down the courthouse steps. His badge gleamed on his belt, not like the uniforms gripping the man in Navy, but heavier administrative, senior, bureaucratic power. He was Captain Douglas Kane, head of courthouse security. The crowd parted slightly as he descended, his eyes sweeping across the scene. Papers on the ground, officers restraining a man in silence, dozens of phones recording. And still, Kane's expression twisted not in shame, but in irritation. "Release him?" a student shouted from the front row. "He hasn't done anything." Kane ignored the voice, stepping closer until he stood eye to eye with the man in Navy. He looked him up and down, gaze dripping contempt. Then, loud enough for everyone to hear, he sneered. "Every week, someone like you tries to walk in here pretending to matter. You think a suit and a briefcase makes you equal to this court?" Gasps rang out. Phones zoomed closer. The insult wasn't hidden, it was broadcast. The man still didn't flinch, his arm still pinned, his briefcase still scattered, his voice steady. "This court was built for justice," he said. "And justice has no uniform." Kane barked a laugh, the sound jagged. "Justice? You're loitering. You're obstructing official business. You're wasting real clients' time." The word real sliced through the air, heavier than the shove had been. The crowd reacted instantly, murmurs, curses, disbelief. One woman shouted, "He is a real client. His name's in the docket." Kane turned on her, eyes narrowing. "Stay in your lane, unless you want contempt charges yourself." But the crowd didn't shrink back. They leaned in, angrier, louder. The plaza wasn't just buzzing now, it was roaring. The younger officer holding the man's wrist twisted harder, encouraged by Kane's presence. "Hear that? You don't belong here." The man's body jerked slightly under the pressure, but his face remained still, his gaze unwavering. Then, slowly, he said, each syllable deliberate, "You don't get to decide who belongs in justice. Justice decides who belongs in you." The words landed like a strike, clean and devastating. The crowd erupted cheers mixing with gasps. Phones captured every second. Kane's smile faltered. His voice rose, harsh, trying to drown the moment. "Enough games. You're a fraud, an imposter parading on these steps. And by the time I'm done, you'll be escorted out in cuffs." The crowd booed, some shouting over him. A young man yelled, "He hasn't raised his voice once. And you call him a fraud?" Another added, "We've got it all on video." But Kane pushed forward, gesturing to his officers. "Cuff him now, before this circus gets worse." The uniforms hesitated, their grip tightening but their eyes flicking nervously toward the dozens of cameras. The evidence was already stacked higher than the courthouse itself. And yet, Kane's order carried weight. They reached for the cuffs. The man finally lifted his head fully, voice firm, unshaken. "You're not putting me in chains. You're chaining yourselves to history." The line hit like a verdict. Phones shook as people gasped, some cheering, others whispering because in that instant, the power on the steps shifted, even if the officers hadn't realized it yet. The clink of handcuffs cut through the roar of the crowd like steel striking stone. The younger officer pulled the chain from his belt, letting it dangle in the air, a deliberate display of power. The plaza gasped. Some shouted, "No!" while others pushed closer, their phones trembling as they tried to capture every second. This was no longer forceful removal, it was humiliation in the making. Captain Kane smirked, his voice dripping with certainty. "Let the record show you tried to defraud the court. And now, in front of every witness here, you'll be removed like the imposter you are." He nodded once. The officers moved. One wrenched the man's wrist higher, the other seized his free hand, yanking it behind his back. The briefcase lay abandoned on the steps, its papers scattered and trampled underfoot. Each sheet a silent indictment of what was happening, each torn edge proof of something far greater than the men holding him could understand. The crowd's outrage swelled into open defiance. A law student shouted, "You can't cuff someone who hasn't resisted." Another added, "This is abuse of authority." A chorus followed, "Shame, shame, shame." Still, the officers pressed forward, snapping one cuff onto his wrist. The metallic bite echoed too loud, as if the entire plaza had heard it. The man didn't resist. He didn't struggle, his shoulders squared, his posture unbroken. He lifted his eyes and spoke so low the crowd had to lean in, yet his words carried with uncanny weight. Every chain you place on me binds you tighter to this moment, and this moment will follow you. The second cuff hovered inches from his other wrist. Phones zoomed closer, the image filling thousands of screens as live-stream comments poured in outrage, disbelief, fury. "Stop," a woman's voice cried from the courthouse doorway. It was the clerk in the tan blazer, her voice shaking but resolute. "His docket is valid. I saw his name this morning. You're violating protocol." Kane's head snapped toward her, his face flushing with rage. "One more word, and you'll be out of a job by sundown." But her voice didn't falter. "You don't get to erase the record. Not today." The crowd roared approval, clapping, shouting, chanting louder now. The energy shifted again, slipping from the officer's grasp. Kane, red-faced and trembling, spat back. "Enough. Fraudulent records mean nothing. We're ending this now." He motioned to the officer with the cuffs. "Finish it!" The officer hesitated, eyes darting to the phones aimed like weapons. But Kane's glare burned hotter. Slowly, reluctantly, the officer lifted the second cuff. The man's arm was pulled back, the steel about to click shut when his voice cut through the plaza, sharper than any siren, steadier than any command. "You are not arresting me. You are arresting the law itself." The words struck like lightning. The crowd exploded, voices crashing into the air. Some cheered, some shouted, all surging forward. The steps vibrated with their fury, and for the first time, the officers froze. The cuff hung open, suspended between obedience and collapse. Because deep down, even they knew, once that steel snapped shut, there would be no turning back. The cuff hung open in the officer's hand, suspended in hesitation. The roar of the crowd pressed against him like a wall. Every phone lens glared, unblinking, documenting his next move. The man in the navy suit exhaled once, steady, controlled. Then, for the first time, he shifted not to resist, but to act. Slowly, deliberately, he tilted his head toward the crowd, then toward the courthouse doors above them all. "Enough," he said softly. The word carried like a verdict. His right hand, still free, slid into his jacket pocket. Gasps rippled through the crowd, some fearing escalation, others bracing for revelation. But what he withdrew wasn't a weapon. It was a phone, sleek, black, its screen already awake. He lifted it calmly to his ear. "This is Carter," he said. His tone was composed, but the plaza heard every syllable. "Initiate Protocol Court 7, immediate execution." The crowd buzzed, confused, whispering, "Protocol? He said that before. What is it?" Kane's face twisted, trying to laugh it off. "Protocol? Is that supposed to scare me? You're a fraud with a phone." But his mockery faltered as the man continued, his voice still level. "Document this moment. Timestamp. Witnesses. All channels live." On the other end of the line, a voice came crisp, professional, undeniable. "Confirmed, sir. Protocol Court 2 activated. Multiple feeds engaged. Internal system logging now." The crowd erupted, half in confusion, half in awe. Phones shook as people realized what they were hearing. This wasn't empty bravado. This was a system, real and ready, already at work. Kane barked, desperate. "Cut that line. Seize his phone." "Oh." But before the officer could move, the man turned his head slightly, gaze cutting through the chaos. "Touch this phone, and you erase your last defense." The officer froze, hand hovering, uncertainty flooding his face. The man straightened, his restrained arm still held but his presence towering now. His words rolled across the steps, steady and damning. "You've scattered my documents, broken my property, and tried to chain me. Now every second of it is logged by your cameras and mine. You thought silence was surrender. It was the record." The crowd exploded, cheers, shouts, the sound of collective realization. Students chanted, "It's recorded! It's recorded!" Phones swung to capture every angle, every uniform's trembling hands. Kane's smirk faltered into a snarl. "You think your little stunt changes anything? You're still in cuffs." The man's gaze didn't waver. "No, you are." The words landed like iron. The crowd roared again, voices breaking into applause and whistles. And as the echoes shook the courthouse steps, one truth spread from phone to phone, post to post, live stream to live stream. This was no longer just an arrest. It was the beginning of judgment. The plaza had gone from tense to electric. Phones weren't just recording anymore, they were transmitting, pouring this confrontation into feeds and timelines faster than Kane could shout it down. The man in navy lowered his phone, his words still reverberating. "You are in cuffs, not me." Kane stepped forward, his suit pulling tight at the shoulders, his authority fraying with each second. "You think you can bluff your way out of this? Who even are you? Some activist? Some con man with a nice tie?" The crowd murmured, leaning in. The question wasn't just Kane's anymore, it was everyone's. Who was this man who stood unshaken while uniforms closed in? Who could summon a protocol with a phone call and make officers freeze mid-command? The man's lips curved not a smile, but something quieter. Inevitable. He lifted his voice, not loud, but strong enough to silence the roar. "My name," he said, "is Judge Malcolm Carter." The plaza froze. Phones wavered in trembling hands. Gasps cut through the air like a blade. Kane blinked, his smirk cracking. "Judge what?" Carter's eyes locked onto his. "Chief Judge of this court. The very court you've just disgraced." The eruption was immediate shouts, cheers, cries of disbelief. Some clapped, some screamed. One woman near the steps pressed her hands to her mouth, whispering, "Oh my God, it's him." The clerk in the tan blazer stepped forward again, voice shaking but loud. "He's telling the truth. His docket wasn't a case to attend, it was a schedule to preside." Judge Carter was meant to open session this morning. Phones swung to her, then back to him, capturing her confirmation. The truth was no longer a whisper. It was testimony, broadcast. Kane's face drained of color. No, that's not possible." Carter stepped closer, his restrained arm slipping free as the officers hesitated, trembling now. "You called me a fraud. You called me an imposter. You tried to chain me outside my own court." His voice cut sharper, slicing through the noise. "You mistook silence for weakness. That was your last mistake." The crowd roared, the chant rising again, louder this time. "Justice! Justice! Justice!" Kane stumbled back a half step, sweat beading at his temple. The officers who had gripped Carter's arms slowly released, their cuffs hanging useless. One whispered, barely audible, "Chief Judge." Carter turned, his gaze sweeping the plaza, his words deliberate, recorded by every phone. "You've witnessed it. This isn't just my humiliation. It's the humiliation of law itself, and law will answer." The cheering swelled, voices crashing like a verdict delivered by hundreds at once. On the courthouse steps, the balance had shifted. The accused was revealed as judge, and the accusers exposed as criminals. And in that moment, justice no longer belonged to uniforms or titles. It belonged to the truth, undeniable and recorded forever. For a moment, silence stretched across the courthouse steps, as if the plaza itself had stopped breathing. Then the realization hit in waves. Gasps turned into shouts. Phones shook in hands. The words "Chief Judge" ricocheted across the crowd, whispered, repeated, shouted louder each time until the entire square buzzed with it. "Chief Judge Carter," someone yelled, voice breaking with awe. "It's him! It's really him!" The officers who had tried to cuff him recoiled like men burned by their own hands. One stumbled backward, the cuffs slipping from his grip and clattering against the stone. The sound was final, like a gavel closing a case they'd just lost. The younger officer's face drained pale. He looked to Kane for direction, but Kane was already faltering, his composure unraveling thread by thread. Sweat beaded on his brow, his jaw tight with panic. "Chief Judge," the clerk in the tan blazer repeated, louder now, her voice carrying authority it hadn't before. "I told you he belonged here, and you ignored me." The crowd erupted in cheers, some clapping, others chanting Carter's name. Strangers leaned into one another, whispering, "We saw it all. We caught every second." Phones panned to the officers, catching their trembling hands, their reddened faces. Every shift of guilt was broadcast live, their shame preserved forever. Kane tried to raise his voice, but it cracked under the weight of hundreds of eyes. This doesn't change the fact that he resisted." "Resisted what?" A lawyer in the crowd barked back, his voice booming with courtroom authority. "Resisted your assault? Your lies?" The plaza roared approval. Someone shouted, "We've got the footage." Another yelled, "It's already online." Carter stood at the center of it all, still, composed, yet towering above them. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone commanded the square. He turned his gaze toward Kane, his tone low, surgical. "You called me a fraud outside my own court. You mocked me before my witnesses, and you ordered me chained like a criminal." Kane's lips parted, but no sound came out. The power he had wielded minutes earlier was gone, stripped clean under the weight of truth. The younger officer muttered, almost to himself, "We didn't know." His voice cracked, guilt spilling into the open. Carter didn't look at him. His eyes stayed locked on Kane. "Ignorance is no shield," he said. "You acted not from law but from prejudice. And now, the law will act on you." The crowd cheered, voices rising like a verdict delivered by the people themselves. One by one, witnesses stepped forward, students, clerks, lawyers speaking into their phones, declaring what they had seen. The testimony was unstoppable, woven into dozens of feeds. Kane's authority collapsed under the weight of it all. His face paled, his jaw trembling. Behind him, the courthouse doors loomed higher than ever, no longer his fortress but Carter's bench. The truth was in the open now, undeniable. The chief judge stood where they had tried to erase him, and the ones who mocked him stood on trial before the entire world. And there was no verdict left to deliver but their own downfall. The crowd was no longer just bearing witness. They were the chorus of justice itself, echoing through every phone, every live stream, every trembling uniform on the steps. The shift was complete. Carter stood at the center, no longer restrained, no longer questioned. Kane tried one last time, voice ragged, desperate. "This is a misunderstanding. We didn't know who you were." Carter's eyes sliced through the excuse. "You didn't need to know who I was. All you needed to know was the law. And you broke it." The words struck harder than any gavel. The crowd erupted again, cheering, clapping, stomping on the marble steps. Phones zoomed in, capturing Kane's face as the truth cornered him. Carter raised his phone once more, his tone calm, deliberate. "Record this," he said into the line. "Effective immediately. Terminate Captain Douglas Kane from courthouse service. Terminate Officers Riley and Hunt as well. Suspend their credentials, revoke their clearances, and log this incident under judicial misconduct." The voice on the other end responded without hesitation. "Confirmed, Judge Carter. Processing now." Almost instantly, the officers' radios crackled and died. Their badges buzzed red as the embedded chips deactivated. The sound was unmistakable access denied. The younger officer stared down at his badge, blinking as the red light pulsed. No, wait." He tapped it desperately, but it stayed dead. The crowd gasped, then roared in satisfaction. Someone shouted, "He just fired them. Right here." Another echoed, "Justice! Live!" Kane's face drained white. He tugged at his badge, but it, too, glowed a final, damning red. His voice shook. You can't do this on the steps." Carter stepped closer, his presence towering though his tone remained calm. "I can, because authority doesn't end at these doors. It begins here." "I?" The crowd erupted again, applause, whistles, chants of his name. The courthouse plaza had become a courtroom, the people its jury, the phones its record. Kane stumbled back, words failing him. He looked around as though searching for support, but found only phones raised higher, eyes colder, judgment heavier. The clerk in the tan blazer stepped forward, steady now, empowered by the tide. "It's over," she said, her voice ringing clear. "Everyone saw. Everyone knows." And a blank. The lawyers in the crowd nodded, some already dictating notes into their phones, others raising their voices. "Charges must follow. No immunity for prejudice." Carter turned once more, his gaze sweeping the plaza. His words fell like iron. "This is not just dismissal. This is evidence. What you've seen today is logged, preserved, and will be tried. They thought chains would silence me, but law was never theirs to weaponize. It was always mine to uphold." The roar that followed shook the marble pillars. Strangers clapped each other on the back, students cried out with joy, even seasoned attorneys lifted their phones higher, as if saluting. And standing at the center, Judge Carter didn't smile. He didn't need to. The act of justice itself was satisfaction enough. The plaza thundered with applause, chants, and the echo of justice served in real time. Phones still hovered, but now they trembled with excitement instead of fear. The narrative had flipped completely. The accused stood free, and the accusers stood exposed. Judge Carter bent once, gathering a handful of his scattered papers. He brushed the dust from one page and slid it back into the battered briefcase. The gesture was simple, but the symbolism cut deep. They had tried to desecrate his work. Now he reclaimed it before their eyes. He turned back to the crowd. His voice didn't rise to match their cheers. It didn't need to. It carried because it was steady, deliberate, and final. Justice, he began, does not need chains or shouts or threats. It needs truth. And today, truth revealed who belongs on these steps. The crowd hushed, their silence sharper than noise. Every ear bent toward him. They thought my silence was surrender, he continued. But silence is not weakness. Silence is record. It preserves every word, every action, every insult, and it delivers them back in judgment. Applause broke out, punctuated by shouts of, "Yes," and "Say it again." Phones captured his face, his presence, his authority. He stepped forward, toward Kane and the officers whose badges now glowed red in their failure. You believed uniforms gave you power, but power without justice is nothing. Today, you are not officers of the law. You are evidence against it. The crowd erupted again, this time with a rhythm, a chant. Evidence! Evidence! Carter raised a hand, and the chant softened. His eyes swept the crowd, then the courthouse looming above. Remember this, he said, his tone cutting clear. Justice doesn't start in the courtroom. It starts the moment someone says, "You don't belong." And it ends when the truth answers. I always did. The words hung suspended, heavier than stone. Phones caught them, sealed them, shared them. 1,000 timelines carried his voice outward, unstoppable. Behind him, the courthouse doors opened wide. A junior bailiff, pale with awe, announced, "Court is ready to convene, Chief Judge." Carter lifted his briefcase, scarred but intact, and mounted the steps again. Each stride erased the insult, replaced humiliation with dignity. The crowd parted, cheering, chanting his name. At the top, he turned one last time, his final words sharp enough to echo against the pillars. I don't need to replay the clip. I am the verdict. The plaza exploded in cheers. Applause rolled like thunder. And as Judge Carter disappeared into the courthouse, the crowd knew they had witnessed more than drama. They had witnessed justice, swift, quiet, undeniable.